always, you know, so
Mhm.
nice when, you're talking to him and, the learning that you get even just talking,
Yeah,
having a discussion with him is like, it's, yeah,
yeah. There's a lot of wisdom. Yeah,
yes, absolutely, absolutely.
yeah.
So,
Mm.
once Namrata makes me the host, I'll just
Yeah,
hit the record button and then we can begin with the
sure.
session.
Yep.
Okay.
It's already
All right.
being streamed on YouTube, so you are
Live.
already being. Yep, you're the
All right.
host now. Yep,
All right.
thanks.
Thank you, Namrata. Hello and welcome everyone to the fourth edition of Ananke's Women in Literature Festival. This is our last and a session that I've been looking so forward to, engaging with Nuzhat Abbas. Welcome, Nuzhat, uh,
Mhm.
to this literary festival.
Thank you. It's been such a pleasure getting to know you and to know the festival, and to listen in because I've been actually tuning in to YouTube and checking out all the different sessions as well.
Likewise, the pleasure is all mine. We had a wonderful session, Trace Press panel yesterday, which was so insightful. So thank you so much for that as well. Um, and I would like to begin this conversation with you telling us, the audience, about your journey and especially your professional journey. So to you.
Okay. I think, like a lot of feminists, the professional and the personal are very interconnected. And so I think what's been interesting about starting Trace has been how it's all kind of come together, and things that for me were very separated because my own life was very um, migrant. My family were refugees from Zanzibar. I was born in Zanzibar, um, and actually moved to the mainland, to Tanzania, and then some of them moved to Pakistan. So I lived in Pakistan for several years, um, not as a citizen, but that in itself was a very interesting way to sort of re-enter a space that because we were of Indian origin, originally from Gujarat, to be then across the border in Pakistan during a very tumultuous time of the 70s was very transformative for me, including interacting with another language, with Urdu, which was foreign to me. Um, and so all of that was, I think, part of the many, many things that have, in the end, influenced my work across the years. And also at Trace, I went back to Tanzania. We then migrated to Canada. I lived and worked in Europe, in Spain and Turkey. I went to grad school in the United States in my 30s, and then came back and taught for many years. And I've also always been a community activist from the time I came to Canada. So one of the things that also happened was um, a great amount of racism that was very prevalent, that my family members in the UK had experienced. It was something I was very aware of from childhood, that as we went out as refugees and migrants, that the receiving countries saw us at other. And also, I grew up within a socialist Tanzania and a quasi-socialist Pakistan. And I think members of my family were, some of them very progressive, some of them very right wing, some of them became very religious during the 80s, 70s, and 80s because of the Iranian Revolution. I'm Shia. And also what was happening in Pakistan in terms of the growth of Zia Haq in that whole period. So I think all of these were very influential, and then the kind of impact of the global north and the kind of at that time I was very proudly third world, and so that first world context was one that I entered. I think unlike some immigrants, even though I was very, very young, that I was appalled that I would have to, for example, um, have a queen on my money, and how Canada was very much embedded in its colonial history. It was very apparent to me as a very young person entering. So I think all of that connects to kind of where we even enter as publishers at Trace, that we're located in Toronto on Indigenous lands, um, in this place called Canada. And what is literature in that context? And I think So in that Canadian context, what we have is, and I've been teaching about this as well over the years and teaching around it, and also organizing around it as a cultural activist, right? So I think all these sort of threads of living on Indigenous lands, coming in as an immigrant, having had a refugee experience, which meant my entire clan was dispersed around the world, some we never saw again. So all of those things and how that manifests and what intrigues me and always has brought me to in literature, that literature became the space that I could understand both the political experience, but also on very personal levels and on literary, on the level of language, and that you make something new with language. Language itself becomes a homeland through which all these things gather.
Before we go to my next question, which is about your what led you to Trace, you talk about being a cultural activist, and I'd like to know, with your lived experience as a refugee, how all that comes into play as a cultural activist.
Well, I think my refugee experience, we did end up getting Tanzanian citizenship. So I kind of did have a passport. So that whole, I think for Zanzibaris, it's always been a very complicated thing because I don't think we were even recognized. And certainly South Asian countries, India and Pakistan, did not embrace us either. So we were kind of lost in that place. And it was a very, very tumultuous time. That's a whole area of South Asians in East Africa that I have strong opinions about, and I can talk about at some other point, including, the racism within South Asian communities. But I think in terms of coming to North America, what happened in the 80s, which is when I migrated, was there was a group of South Asians who started organizing. In the UK, they'd been there longer, so we were inspired by them. But for example, I worked with as a very young person, I joined a group of older women, South Asian women, to start the South Asian Women's Group, which became the South Asian Women's Center, which was just an immigrant center that supported women like my mother to get jobs and, working class women to find. And also we worked around women wanting to leave their marriages, who needed support, shelters, things like that. There was nothing around at that time, very little. So that was my early kind of work. And then I was involved with a group of mainly queer South Asian men. At that time, we called themselves gay men because the word queer was less common in those years. And there was a group called Hush at that time, and they started something called Salam Toronto, which then evolved when some of us were more left-wing, more political, a lot more women came in and kind of moved it. It became this big cultural festival that was it included everybody. It wasn't only queer-centered, but it always retained a sort of queer perspective on what makes the nation. So I think this whole idea of woman nation, who's the proper citizen of a nation, that was kind of there. And it was called Desh Pradesh, and it ran in Toronto. It had films, dance, activist stuff, working peoples, and it's kind of had offshoots. There's a group called SAVAK that does visual art until today, which is wonderful. There's the Workers' Action Center, which works with labor issues in Toronto. So there's been this wonderful history of activism, both cultural but also community-based, for migrants and refugees. And then my own work was always, it meandered. I mean, I kind of had to work. I was not a rich person. I lived on my own from a very young age. But I was an ESL teacher, so I worked with immigrants and refugees as an ESL teacher, but then I also worked abroad. I worked in Spain and Turkey just teaching English. And then when I came back, I think I also ran a community arts practice called Migrant Memory Project, which worked with just workshops, creative workshops we did a workshop for Afghan teenage girls, which was really wonderful, around 2006, I think. Things like that. We work with seniors, Toronto is a city that's almost 50% immigrants and lots of refugees. The whole world comes here.
Yeah, true. That's very true.
Yeah.
So tell us about, the route or the journey that brought about Trace Press.
Okay. So just professionally, I was teaching at colleges and universities at the same time. So there's a whole other part of my sort of career that has been just classroom-based teaching, literature, film, things like that. I think in 2019, I was approached by a professor at the University of Toronto. She was working on a project on political prisoners in Iran. That's a big project that she works on. And she had this poem that she wanted to create as a kind of illustrated book. And she knew I'd done publication as part of my work. And we got into a conversation, and she's like a Marxist left-wing feminist professor, very well known. And I kind of was curious. I like making things, and I kind of like the sort of creative work. And we made that book, and it's called Lives Lost in Search of a New Tomorrow. So it's a sort of a very political poem with these lovely illustrations that an artist did and a translator. And I kind of worked to bring in a better translator to translate the poem. And just the making of the book, I realized how much I loved it. And how important. And I also feel like there's been a history in Canada of there were feminist presses, there were even in North America, and there were feminist bookstores, and everything started collapsing around. There was one very important press called Sister Vision, run by Makeda Silveira, who was a Jamaican lesbian writer, activist in Toronto, very, very important press that made room for women of color to publish lots of anthologies. And I felt there was this whole history of feminist work, of people of color work, that just, because of neoliberalism, the whole 2000, that whole period, just the last feminist bookstore in Toronto closed, which was very, very sad. So I felt there was a need for a space to create the kind of books that perhaps people like me may want to read. And that kind of countered sort of a Canadian nationalism that's very prevalent here, partly because we have a huge neighbor to the south that's very dominant, but also sort of this English-French idea of Canada Council funding. There are benefits to the funding, but it also creates boundaries. I'm giving very long answers.
No,
I'm
no,
sorry
no, no,
for
no,
giving so
not
long.
at all, not at all. No, no, no,
Yeah.
not at all. So, talking about Trace Press, talk us through, the endeavor itself and, the effort and the challenges of establishing a publishing entity.
It's been a lot. I think we were already a nonprofit because we call Migrant Memory Project. And so I moved it towards Trace Press. The name itself came out of my own sort of interest in history and memory. It came out of an actual physical exercise I was doing of writing and erasing letters and seeing the trace remain. And my own interest in translation as both a method and a practice and a way in which even when cultures cross over, the politics of language comes into play and something else happens. And I think I'm interested in that something else, both in actual texts that get produced. And I wanted to look at it, like what happens when books and ideas and people move across spaces. So that was a thing. The challenge has been very much in terms of funding. Canada has 82% white male-founded presses that received funding from the government from the 70s onwards. There are a lot more white women working in publishing, and since 2020, there's been a concerted effort to bring in more Black, Indigenous, and people of color. However, that because of the way the funding's set up, you have to have 4 books or 6 books or 10 books for some funding. It's very hard to enter. Basically, there's no support for being a startup. So that's been our biggest challenge, which I've kind of been countering through basically applying as an artist, using my own artist funds to fund books, So we're still figuring those things out. So after that first book we did in 2019, because of COVID, we pulled back. It gave me a lot of time to think and to start building connections with translators. And we came up with this project that I did receive some funding for. So I was able to pay. I'm very keen on wanting to pay my writers and to everyone who works with me. Right now, I don't pay myself, but much. Once in a while, I'll get some fee, but otherwise, it's been I make sure that everyone else who's in the chain gets paid. And partly is Toronto's an expensive city, and most living in the global north is very expensive, and most artists are struggling. So it's really important. And so we worked on what at that time was called a project called Unsettling Translation, where I brought together writers and poets, women mainly from global south backgrounds, to think about translation as a practice, but also its politics. So we had poets, for example, who work in their lives bilingually, but who write in English, but who think very carefully about what it means to write in English when you're translating a whole life world into English, say from, like, for example, one of our writers who I really admire, Otnia, is originally from Uganda. She talks about what it means to be a Choli. We had a writer from Rwanda who's also kind of thinking through what does it mean to translate from Kinyarwanda, oral histories, oral stories. So it was a fantastic collection, amazing conversations took place over the whole period. And that's become sort of our main book, right? This one is now called River in an Ocean. So that idea of unsettling translation remains what we do. We also ran 2 workshops, one on translating Tamil with Nidra Rodrigo and Geeta Sukumar. Nidra spoke yesterday in the panel, and one on translating from Arabic with Nora Al-Kharashi and Yasmin Haj, who are also both all authors in the collection. And we kind of keep that going. We kind of work very collaboratively with people we've worked in one aspect. We kind of bring them in to work again. And so now we're making collections of little small anthologies out of what came out of the workshops. So that's been really wonderful, actually. And one of the things that translators often complain about, and translators who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color, is that translation from the global South is very limited into English. It's like 3%, maybe now it's growing. And the majority of translators remain. It's a very white-dominated field still.
I'd like to know what your mission or your goal is as far as Trace Press is concerned.
I think I'm in that interesting place where when I started, I was really clear. And now I've kind of gotten in a place where I'm having to think about it a little bit more deeply. So I'm in that place this summer. So I won't have all the right answers right now because we're growing fast. We've received a tremendous amount of love for this book we put out, and a lot of interest in what we're doing. So there's a lot of expectation, but of course we don't have the resources to fulfill always, or the capacity as yet, to do the things we want to do. But I have very clear goals. I think what makes Trace very particular is kind of that I have a background in comparative literature as well. So my enormous interest in literature, on global literatures, not just from South Asia, but very much from Africa, from the Middle East. And also I'm familiar with literatures in Europe, in Latin America, in Brazil, so I have in Southeast Asia. So I have this enormous interest and passion and kind of a bibliophiliac, insanity, as you can see at the back. I also used to work in bookstores. So I also grew up deprived of books because in Tanzania in the 70s, it was really hard to find books. So I'm a bit, obsessed with books. But also to bring in feminist and queer perspectives in literature, but not uniquely so. So we're kind of open, but it's a way of questioning, I think, national literatures. And I think I see Trace as very much a place where a kind of literature allows us to question things. It also allows us to bring in beauty. And I'm quite, obsessed with beauty as well in the writing that we publish. So we'd like to do, ideally 4 to 6 books a year. We like to do events. A lot of our events are also online, so we can bring in transnational audiences as well. And we were trying to create community and solidarity. I think that's also been very, very important to us as we grow.
You talk about publications. So tell me more about, your published works, Trace's published work.
Well, I think River in an Ocean has
And
been.
I'd like you to hold that again, please.
Oh, okay, sure. Here it is with Lala Rook, who's a Pakistani artist and a very good friend of my partner's who passed away. And it was interesting because the project was called Unsettling Translation, and I kind of woke up. Somebody else then published an academic anthology called that. I was like, oh, I can't use that anymore. And I was struggling for a name, and I kind of woke up with this image of Lala's one day in my head that I'd seen on her studio wall in Lahore. And that became then really, it brought together a lot of this work. And so that's been, the book has been an intervention into conversations on translation. It's kind of raised questions, and I've realized it went way beyond what I even expected, that people really resonated with what the essayists were saying. It's trying to get taught in translation programs. And I think because it brought together people from various parts of the world, and who were also, I invited them to write very experimentally, but also critically and theoretically, but to bring it together in a kind of writing that was also personal. So there was a lot of back and forth. It was a very communal effort. And I think that makes it quite unique. So that's a book we're very, very proud of. The new projects we're working on are more poetry. So the Tamil one is very interesting because the Tamil workshops looked at ideas of landscape in Tamil poetry, but also how it gets subverted or rewritten. And the translators were experimenting a lot in our workshops. And so that'll come out so we're seeing it almost as like a workbook in some way, but also an example of continuing to unsettle ideas around translation and bringing in people and inviting them into becoming translators. The Arabic text, which is called Harb, which, because in Arabic, hub is love and harb is war, and we're bringing that into play. It's still in development, both these texts. We hope to get it out by the end of the summer. It's more poetry in translation from across the Middle East, and it has a very, very powerful introduction around what is happening right now. So those are 2 texts for this year. For next year, we have some more happening. I think I can only speak of one that might interest your South Asia audiences. So this is the first time I'm speaking about it because it's been
Wow, that's amazing.
I'm very nervous, so I hope the author is going to forgive me, or maybe she wants me to talk about it. So it's a memoir. So we have a nonfiction line as well. So we do translations, and we also have a literary nonfiction line, which is, again, experimental, multi-genre kind of writing. And I invited Maher Faruqi, who's a very well-known critic of Ghalib and scholar. But I'd heard her write and speak about certain things, and it intrigued me, and I invited her to think through. And we've been working on a memoir about her life, her relationship with her very, very famous father, who was a very famous translator, Shamsul Faruqi, and it's a very feminist text. It explores gender, it explores poetry, it works through poetry. And also, I think it's a document of a Muslim India that is right now also under siege. So it's a really profound, it's a beautiful, very small, very, very poetic text. So it's not a conventional memoir by any means. So anyone wanting, that's not the kind of book it is. But it brings in a lot of these questions into the text. So that we're going to be releasing that next year as well.
Wow.
And we're also working on some other things.
Wow, that is amazing. I'm looking forward to that.
Yes.
Going back to the challenge of funding,
Mm.
and there are so many layers to that. the most basic one is, being an independent publisher, right? On top of that, being a feminist independent publisher, a woman of color. So there's so many layers to that. So uh, uh, tell us about your experience.
Um, it was very funny because I remember during the pandemic, I should also do a shout out to two people who gave me really good advice, and I know I'm not following their advice. And one of them was Urvashi Butalia, because I did reach out because I was frustrated being here and kind of hitting walls a lot. And I wanted to learn about publishing, but I knew what a closed system it was in Canada. And I admired Naveen Kishore's work at Seagull tremendously, just because they're such beautiful, beautiful books. And there's no way we could afford to publish something as beautiful. I know his books are just like, I'm in love with the quality of the design, Nandini's artwork. So it's a real model for beautiful publishing. Like, just, I love the actual book itself. You have it, right? Yes. I mean, look at that. It's just so beautifully made. So I think that is something we can't aspire to, at least not yet. But I wish I could find a designer as good as Nandini. Please, if you're out there listening, call me. Um, and and I think also a kind of real love of literature, and that's something I see in Seagull tremendously. But again, they're very much located where they are, but they speak internationally from their location in Calcutta. And I reached out also to Urvashi Butalia, because of course I grew up reading Kali books and then realized they'd been like moved into two different presses with Women Unlimited with Ritu. And so I asked, I felt I got mentored by both Seagull and also through Zaman with Urvashi, and I felt I got a lot of learning around what publishing can be and the kind of things to think about. In terms of fundraising, though, it's a challenge. I'm not quite sure where to go. I'm kind of very much doing the Arts Council stuff right now. I had to bang on a lot of doors before they let me in, but I was very aggressive in some ways, but also very firm. I was like, what I'm doing is important. It has to be supported, even though right now it doesn't fit. So right now in Canada, if I don't publish Canadian authors, I get no money. It's kind of like that. So we're trying to figure all these things out, how we do that. And so for the kind of very global books I want to do, because I don't want to be contained into Canada only, that's still something I'm trying to figure out how to make it happen.
So
we do donations. I mean, we do accept donations on our website, and we have received some. Not a lot, but we have people giving $10 a month, poets and writers, just regular people. I really, really appreciate that a lot. Yeah.
And it is, it should be a collective effort, definitely. Who is your audience?
That's a really good question. When I started, I honestly didn't know. So I'm going to do the Toni Morrison things. Well, Toni Morrison says, I write for myself. But obviously, it's very vain to publish for oneself because publishing costs a lot of money. So one has to recoup that money through sale of books. I think in Canada, I imagine audiences who were multilingual, who were writers and poets and artists of immigrant backgrounds themselves. Also North America, because we do distribute our books across North America. We're trying to start distributing in Europe and the UK and elsewhere as well, but we're still trying to figure that out. We've been surprised at the enormous kind of energy, and we've had a very wide audience. We've had folks from Europe picking up our books, and lots of translators, professors, people in anthropology, creative writing, art history, but also just regular readers. There's a bookstore in Toronto, like one of our best, we have 3 places where our books sell really well. One is in Montreal, and a lot of poets. I think one poet really loved it, a Canadian, European descent poet loved it, and basically lots of people started buying it. And in Toronto, we have this wonderful bookstore called Another Story, where I've known the manager because she used to run the Toronto Women's Bookstore before, Angela Gogia, and she's been a huge supporter of Trace. So I think as independent publishers, I really rely on independent bookstores. And also, we also sell from our website, and a lot of people buy directly, and we distribute, we send it everywhere. So that's all been interesting to find out who our readers are. I'm curious. I think for Meher's book, we'll have more South Asia. It depends on the book, you know. We're going to be doing a whole sort of African series. So again, we'll be reaching out to specific audiences.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm
If I
afraid
sound like I'm not sure, it's because I'm not sure. I'm learning as I go.
yeah, I think it's great to say that because, going into uncharted territory is always fun. And it's not just a learning experience. You get to explore more, you get to navigate more. And that is how magic happens, So I think it's good that way.
Yeah.
Um, and the audience gets to experience that as well. Your audience will experience that magic that comes along the way.
I mean, we've had
But-
amazing reviews. So that's been all over the world. And it's been really interesting to see how many people have been reviewing the book. Yeah.
Before we end this session, any last words, Nuzat?
No, it's just been lovely. So whoever the audience is, first of all, it's been lovely meeting you, Sabine, and the whole team at Ananke and all the women that I've been seeing in other sessions. I think I would love folks to reach out. If folks have advice, please feel free, drop us an email. We have a little contact at tracepress.org. And do visit our website and buy our books directly, because that's always very good for any independent book publisher. We do receive lots of submissions, so be patient with us as we sort through them. And we're very excited. I think also I want to say one last thing that I haven't talked about is that at Trace our primary focus has always been around questions of conflict and displacement. And we've been very active with groups that have emerged to speak out against what is happening in Gaza, Israel's invasion and genocide in Gaza. And I think that is something, I think the whole literary world is being shaken up right now around this, and in a way that actually reveals things that I feel I've known for a long time, but that are now visible. And I think it's a real time in which to start questioning what neoliberalism did, but also that the sort of the histories of colonialism didn't end when people think they ended.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
Even this festival, this event is, it's directly linked, aligned to what is happening in Gaza. Because we need to have difficult conversations, and we need to, highlight, uh, you know, what is so wrong in this world, and we need to all come together. That's the theme, language and erasure, because I feel, we need to have this discourse, this dialogue, dialogue continuously.
I think in this time of like enormous despair, we've all kind of found each other as well by reaching out, and I think there has been tremendous global solidarity, and that is I think the only thing that keeps us going in this really horrific time, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much, Nazat, for this truly interesting and enlightening conversation, especially about independent publishing and funding and the challenges, because all of us, we are struggling with that as well. And, talking about this, about your endeavor and, the challenges and the milestones, I think it was really important. So thank you so much for that.
The pleasure. Really lovely, and good luck with continuing this really lovely festival. I look forward to visiting it next year as well.
Yeah. So
Thank
tomorrow
you.
is the last day. Thank you so much.
Okay, then get some rest.
Yes.
Bye.
Well, that is a wrap. And I hope to see you tomorrow, same time, same place. That's it for me. Thanks. Bye.